Hello, I'm Nikos and I'm the course designer for Soundflow Music Academy, and today I'm going to be taking you through Massive X. Now this is going to be a tutorial series spread across multiple videos where I'm going to be detailing every different aspect of the synthesizer, as well as an emphasis on the routing tab, because the routing in Massive X is incredible. It allows you to basically route any module you want to anything else in the synthesizer that you want. Even create multiple different routing signal flows in the synth. So for example, I could send the oscillators through one signal flow and send them through a second signal flow as well, creating two parallel voices with a different signal chain. It's absolutely incredible. I'm going to walk you through all of that in detail. So without further ado, let's begin. So here is Massive X. Now, I just want to go through the interface, the GUI of Massive X, just so you know what we're looking at. Now, over here where it says 1 and 2, these are the oscillators. Here we've got the noise oscillators, 1 and 2, again, with multiple different wavetables. Now, one more thing is whenever you click on one of these sort of names where there's a little underline, it means that there's a drop-down menu that you can select things from. Now, F, this is the filter. And this is where you can select all the different types of filters. You've got your insert effects, A, B, and C. The amp module, which just basically increases the volume of the whole synth. You can pan it right or left. And you can also increase the feedback amount. We're going to talk about that later. We've got the master effects, X, Y, and Z. And then down here, we've got all of the different modulators. We've got our envelopes, our LFOs, our tracking modulators, which is something that's really interesting. Again, cover that in detail in a future video, and our performers. Now, a couple of things, just like here, I can change the performer to a custom performer or to a basic performer. Any of the envelopes and LFOs, I can change to any kind of envelope or LFO. So we've got modulation envelopes, which is just your normal ADSR. Granted, you've got a few more features here, which are pretty cool. You've got an exciter envelope, which is basically an LFO with one cycle. So it would go positive polarity, negative, and then back to the zero crossing point. In uni, it would just go positive and back. And then in window, very similar to uni. Think about that for a second. I will cover it in the LFO video later on, in the modulation video. But essentially all it is an LFO, but with only one cycle. And then, of course, you've got your normal LFO and your random LFO, which is same thing as a normal LFO. You can still sync the rate, but it will randomize its values, depending on the settings that you choose. Okay, now the routing tab. This is where things get very interesting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click here where you can select all of your different presets, and there is hundreds of them. And then I'm going to go to Quick Start and initialize Massive X blank. Now you might ask, what's the difference between the top one and the bottom one, the blank one? The top one already has routings set. So if you played a note, I'm going to load up the QWERTY keyboard so you can see what I'm playing. We would get sound. Whereas the blank has no routing set up whatsoever. So it's a blank canvas, free for you to do whatever you like. This is how we're going to start. What I will also do, I will load an oscilloscope and an FFT so that you can actually see what's going on with the sound when I'm playing notes. Oh yeah, let me just produce some sound so you can see what it looks like. There you go, we'll be able to zoom right in and see the waveforms, as well as the frequencies the harmonics being produced. Fantastic. So let's start with the oscillator. Now, the oscillators are the heart of your sound. Without the oscillators, really, there wouldn't be a way to get sound through a synthesizer. Almost. There is some ways, but they're not very easy to actually get to work. And also, you're not going to have as much control with the sound unless you use an oscillator. Now, what an oscillator does is it essentially just oscillates, modulates electricity. And by clicking here, we can select how that oscillation will look, what kind of oscillation it will create. So let's say we select the just normal sine, triangle, saw, square. Well, this gives us a choice of a sine wave, a saw wave, a triangle wave, and a square wave. And this is just the way that the electricity, the voltage, would be modulated. So this is a square wave, and it produces this sound. This sound contains these harmonics. Then we go on to a saw wave, and it looks like this, called a saw because it kind of looks like a saw. We've got a triangle wave, which sounds a little bit deeper. You lose some of those higher harmonics. So if you look at the harmonics of a saw and a square compared to a triangle, and then you've got a sine, which is the purest type of waveform there is, the purest sound, because it contains nothing but one frequency, and it looks like this. Okay, now all of these are called wavetables, and a wavetable, simply all it means is it contains more than one waveform. So as you saw, sine, triangle, saw, and square, you can use this, which is known, you just click in the middle and you move it, which is known as the wavetable position. And you can move the position of the wavetable to morph, essentially, between the different waves in the wavetable. If we go to a different wavetable, like a monster wavetable, where the waveforms can be quite aggressive as well, and there can be a lot more of them, you can see how we're morphing the wave and getting a totally different sound. Let's go to formant. And again, same thing. So that's all a wavetable is, essentially. Okay, now we're going to start with just the basic sine, triangle, saw, square. This is what you would find in most analog synths. Digital synths, you can basically program any kind of waveform that you want. But with analog synths, it used to be a little bit more difficult. So you would just have these four: sine, triangle, saw, and square waves. But you can still do a lot with them. You can still modulate them in certain ways to create totally new waveforms as a result. So let's talk about the waveform, the oscillator modes. Now, standard, you can change the mode over here. Standard just means that it will read the waveform as it was designed. So if we're playing a saw wave, it will produce, as you can see in the oscilloscope, a saw wave. However, let's say we read it back with the gorilla algorithm. It will no longer produce a regular saw. It will morph the waveform in one way or another and change how it's read back. So this is the normal saw wave, and this is what gorilla added to it. Now let me go through them one by one. I just wanted to explain what oscillator modes do. So let's go through bend first of all. Now, if you used to use the original Massive, bend should be quite familiar to you. All bend does is it essentially bends the waveform forwards or backwards. Let me produce a sine wave so you can see. It kind of bends it, almost turns it into a saw wave. I find the effect of this is it makes the sound a little bit brighter. It almost reduces the amplitude of the low frequencies and increases the amplitude of the high frequencies. And you can see that represented here. So if you want a slightly brighter sound, bend is quite a good way to go. Now you've got strong, medium, and gentle. This is just how harshly it actually bends the waveform. So you can see that's gentle, that's medium, and that is strong. Okay. Mirror is really cool. This didn't exist in the original Massive, but it does here. And again, you've got bend, which all it will do, one second, is bend the waveform. Okay, but this time I believe to the right, there's no bend. To the left, it's full bend. So keep that in mind. Whereas with normal bend mode, in the middle, it was no bend. To the right, it was full bend. To the left, it was full bend, but the other way around. With mirror, however, where things get interesting is the ratio. It essentially mirrors the waveform and increases the number of cycles, therefore increasing essentially the pitch and the higher harmonics. But it remains melodic. The harmonics seem to sound as though they are harmonically related, which is good, which means you could actually use it melodically or harmonically in a track. You can get some pretty interesting results, especially if you start modulating this. So we could assign something like an envelope. If this is a little bit too advanced for you, don't worry about this. This will be covered in detail in one of the later videos, but we could do something like this. Pretty cool. Now we've got hard sync, which hard sync is really interesting. Basically, it creates a second oscillator, which is known as the master, and it makes your oscillator the slave. Now, let me explain what this means. These are actually the terms that I used with sync. It means that your oscillator normally would be cycling, oscillating, a certain number of times per second. The amount of times it's oscillating depends on the pitch of the note that you're playing. So, let me go back to standard. Pitch of the note that I'm playing right now is 165. I'm going to round it off to 150, just to keep things simple. Now, a frequency of 150, let's say we added a master oscillator to essentially control that frequency of 150, and the master oscillator was playing at a frequency of 300. What would happen is it would force the waveform cycle, the oscillation of the first oscillator, to reset every time a cycle completes in the master oscillator. So you've got the master oscillator and the slave oscillator. The slave resets whenever the master plays, regardless of where the slave is at in its cycle. So here's a slave. Okay, so one cycle would essentially be from the middle point, up, down, back to the middle point. But let's say the second oscillator, the master oscillator, completed a cycle when this one was at this point. It would then force this one to restart its cycle. So it would jump up to the middle point, go positive again, negative, back, which would look something like this. You see how it's creating more peaks and troughs? And it's also starting to sound as though we're raising in pitch, but we're actually not. We're staying at the same pitch, the same note, but the slave oscillator is forcing its cycle to be restarted by the master oscillator. Now, whether you understand this or not, you can look up the details more on the internet and get to understand it more. But what's important is that you simply know what it sounds like, because when you're making music, getting bogged down with the math of it all isn't as important as simply knowing what a certain parameter would sound like. And if you need that sort of sound, apply it and you're off. So what this will do is simply make it sound metallic, make the pitch sound as though it's rising, but you're still staying in the same pitch. So if you notice on the frequency scope, we still have our fundamental frequency here, but it's sort of the additional harmonics that are being raised in amplitude. And there are certain points when you move the ratio, which by the way adjusts the pitch of the master oscillator. There are certain points that make it sound really, really good. Like here. Very, very nice. Okay, now there is hard sync, soft sync, and grain. Soft sync is very, very similar. However, instead of forcing the cycle of the oscillator that you're playing to restart, it simply inverts its phase. So, you know, the result of this, to be honest, is that it sounds quite similar, but a little bit softer on the aggressiveness. So you lose some of those harmonics. It almost makes the harmonics that it's peaked more noticeable, because you lose some of the harmonics around that place. Cool. Then you've got grain, which just softens the sound, really reduces the amplitude of all the other harmonics other than the ones that are being produced by moving the ratio control. Soft. So this, for me, would be less useful from a musical standpoint, because it would be more difficult for me to get something that sounds accurately in tune with the track that I'm playing. But again, if you take your time and adjust the ratio control until you get to a nice interval of the original frequency, you can get great sounding results. Okay, you've got rap, which sounds quite similar again. Very similar. And then you've got grain, soft, and hard. Again, two very, very similar effects. Although you'll notice even on hard, you still lose a lot of the harmonics that were there originally in the waveform, whereas with hard sync, okay, it's also lower pitched. But of course you can raise it up as much as you like. And the thing is, because there isn't a manual release for Massive X, it's difficult to know, other than hard sync and these modes, which are in other synthesizers, it's difficult to know what, for example, Gorilla does in rap, because they haven't released the information. Not sure they actually will, but you can still load up an oscilloscope and see what is going on. A very, very similar effect to hard sync. Formants essentially takes different harmonics that are being produced by your oscillator waveform and raises them in pitch, like this. So basically, you know, the effect of this is it increases where the majority of the energy, the amplitude, is contained within the harmonics that are being produced from the wavetable that you are playing. It's really cool, to be honest. It's nice for keeping things sounding in tune, but still creating a brighter sound. Let's use this with a square wave. Okay. ART, similar effect. A little bit harsher, a little bit more aggressive. Again, if we look at what it's doing to the waveform, let's go back to so. So it's simply adding more and more cycles, but it's retaining this saw, the original essentially shape. Which means even when you've raised the pitch, like here, where it's raised a lot of peaks, you still have the original fundamental harmonics. Very cool. Again, you've got hard, bitty, or bitey, just a different algorithm, and soft. Okay. Gorilla is something everybody has been talking about. So Gorilla is sort of like a new mode that Massive X has introduced to read a waveform in a very aggressive way. Again, it's kind of similar to hard sync and rap and so on, but it's much more aggressive. And it's almost like it's taking notches, boosting them in volume, and kind of moving them almost like a comb filter would move the boosts of a sound. And it's very easy to get harmonically related results using this. Now you've got a few different modes. You've got king, kang, and kong. Kang is my favorite. You get that aggressiveness, but it still sounds thick. You know, there isn't any high-pitched frequencies that poke out too much, which in king you do get. It's not as much of a scream. It's more of a saturation. And then you've got kong as well, which I find to be an even sort of softer version than kang. Now you've also got this multiplier, which again, because there's no manual, it's difficult to tell you exactly what it does, but try out the different multiplications. You get totally different results. Even from a sine wave, which remember normally only produces one frequency, get some really cool results. So think of the possibilities here. Think of the amount of options you've got. Not only do you have hundreds of wavetables to choose from, which all sound different, but you can take even the simplest wavetable, a sine wave, and read it through the Gorilla mode and create a totally new wavetable out of it. If we look at the waveform of this now, let's go with... That is no longer a normal sine wave. We've created something totally new simply by choosing a basic wavetable such as sine and picking the mode Gorilla. Now, if we had a square wave, it'd be even more aggressive. Okay. Finally, we've got random and jitter, which essentially just pull out individual samples of the waveform and just play them back. So it sounds pretty lo-fi, distorted. You can see we're not getting a normal square wave. You can change the amount of jitter with this and the clicks with this. So you may have heard some producers create this sort of effect at the beginning of their tracks where it starts like this. And slowly goes up to the normal sound. Cool. A couple of different modes. It just changes the way that it pulls out samples of the waveform. And then jitter, very similar effect. But you've also got a filter. So you can actually low pass filter the sound. Then you've got random and switch. Keep it on random for now. You'll get better results. Again, a couple of different algorithms. So this is more almost like a pitching down. And random actually randomizes the pitch. It's almost like a sample and hold effect, like you could use in the old massive, or even here, you've got sample and hold, which we'll go through in a later video. So yeah, so far, these are the capabilities of the oscillator when it comes to the wavetables and to the different modes to actually play back the oscillator. Now we're just going to go with standard, with a square wave, and I want to walk you through quickly phase modulation. Now, phase modulation, all it simply does, also known as frequency modulation, is it modulates the actual pitch of your sound. So I'm going to assign PM1, so this, phase modulator 1, to phase modulate oscillator 1. Now, the amount of phase modulation will be determined by this PM1 control. And the waveform that is used to modulate, the shape that is used to modulate the phase modulate oscillator 1 depends on this waveform that you select over here. We're going to go with the basic sine. And I'm also going to turn down the pitch of the phase modulation oscillator by 65. Well, this is actually in percent, but I'll explain that in a minute. So if I play a sound now, you'll be able to hopefully clearly hear what it's doing to the sound. Do you hear that pitch rising and lowering? Let me go an octave higher. However, if I put this back to its normal value, it's going to modulate the pitch in that way, but key tracked, which means at the frequency of the note that you're playing, which actually keeps it sounding in tune, but adds a lot of aggressiveness to the sound. Even on a sine wave. Now, if you change the waveform used for the phase modulation oscillator, changes the sound. I recommend listening to all of them and really learning the way they sound, because this is the only way you'll be able to quickly decide what to choose when you're creating sounds for your own tracks. But here's where it gets really interesting. You see where it says auxiliary, aux. I can actually assign the aux here to phase modulate either oscillator, oscillator 1 or oscillator 2 or both. Now, what does this mean? Back to the routing tab. I could assign oscillator 2 to modulate PM aux, which means phase modulate to auxiliary, by the way, which means oscillator 2's waveform, pitch, amplitude will actually be phase modulating the oscillator that has auxiliary assigned to it. So instead of using the wavetables, the basic waveforms here on phase modulator 1 to phase modulate either oscillator, I can actually use oscillator 2 and select any one of these hundreds of wavetables to phase modulate oscillator 1. Let's listen to what that sounds like. So this would be quite similar to, but just in this, because they both control the amount of phase modulation. But you see, if I morph through the wavetable, you get some incredible resulting sounds which you cannot get with PM1 or PM2 and the basic wavetables here, because you cannot morph between any different waveforms. But with this configuration, you can. You could even get oscillator 2 to phase modulate oscillator 2 by activating aux here. Granted, right now it produces a lot of noise, but depending on the oscillator we pick, you get some pretty interesting results. Very cool. Okay, couple more things that you should know about this. This would normally adjust the pitch of the phase modulation oscillator. Now, the thing is, when you adjust the pitch of the phase modulation oscillator, it can very quickly sound inharmonic, which means you can choose a semitone, a frequency that just would not fit with your track musically. So what they've done here is they've actually changed it to a percentage value so that it's easier to get harmonically pleasing results. So if I turn this up, they all pretty much sound harmonically related, harmonically pleasing, which means you could use them in the context of a piece of music, of your track. This is extremely, extremely useful, because people who don't know very much about music theory and about scales, this will make it a lot easier for you to get a good result from the phase modulator. Now, if we were to use oscillator 2 to modulate the phase, we then have complete control over the pitch. You see, 3 semitones up doesn't sound pleasing in any way. 5 sounds good. 7 sounds good. 9 sounds good. 12 sounds good. 10, 11, not so good. Whereas with PM1, activate it. Anything you choose, pretty much sounds good. So it skips all those nasty sounding intervals, which is fantastic. Okay, now a couple more things. All of these little boxes, the sort of light gray background boxes, they're basically modulation assignment boxes. So you could assign any modulator to modulate them. So I'm going to drag the crosshair from LFO4 into the little box here and select the amount of modulation. And if I go to LFO4, I'm just going to sync the rate, slow it down. You can hear the pitch shifting. Let me turn off phase modulation. So that's all these are. Modulation assignments, 2 for each pitch control. Finally, a couple of things that you should be aware of is this polarity and forward and back. Now, let's say you had 2 oscillators because you wanted to combine the 2 to produce a separate sound. So we're going to go with a square on oscillator 2 and a saw on oscillator 1. A saw produces harmonics, a square doesn't have. However, a square can beef up the low frequencies of a sound because it has higher amplitude in the low frequencies. Now, depending on the way the polarity is, it's actually going to give you completely different results. So let me also route oscillator 2 to the output so we can hear the combination of the 2. Now, if I change the polarity to minus, right, in order to actually accurately hear this, I need to go to voicing tab and select reset all. What this does is every time you play a note, it will force the oscillators to restart with their phase set to 0. You can actually change where the phase will be set with here and here. Okay, we'll keep them in the middle so they both start with the same phase in the middle with positive polarity and then negative. Now, what positive polarity means, I'll just turn oscillator 2 off for a moment, is that it starts with the polarity going up and then down. If I select polarity minus, it will do the opposite. We'll go down first and then up. Now, let's say you had 2 wavetables with the same waveform. One of them was polarity minus, the other one was polarity positive. You would get no sound because one would be starting with polarity down, the other one with the polarity up, and they would phase cancel each other out. Okay? You've also got forwards and backwards. So backwards would basically play the waveform in reverse. Slowly up and then down in this case, rather than up immediately and down. So again, if you had 2 waveforms that are very similar, one playing forward, the other one playing backwards, in this case, they actually make a square wave. So totally different results compared to them playing both forwards. Let's go to a square and a saw and see the results. So like this, backwards. So you lose some of those high frequencies when you select the waveform to be played in a reverse order. Polarity minus. This takes away a lot of the low frequencies. They phase cancel each other out. This dulls the harmonics quite a lot as well. Again, they phase cancel each other out. So what I would do with these, most of the time, I'd leave the waveforms to forwards with polarity plus, but it's just good to be aware that if you change these, you may be drastically changing the resulting sound that you get, okay? Now, the reason why I had to select reset all is because on free run, every time you play a note, it selects a different point in the cycle. So it could be here, or it could be here at the beginning, or here at the top, to start playing the waveform, the oscillator. And that way, they will phase with each other differently every time you play a note. So if you want consistent results, if you want the sound to be the same every single time you play it, which is extremely useful, especially if you're making sort of a bass sound, a low frequency sub, or any sort of lead that should have consistency, you want to go to the voice tab and turn reset all on, which means they will be consistent, same exact sound every single time you play a note. Fantastic. Now, it'd be great if you go out and experiment with these. If you simply load Massive X, try all the different oscillator combinations, the wave tables, the phase modulators, play around with the routing tab and see how you can route the oscillators through the filters, through the insert effects, or directly to the master outputs. It'd be really, really useful. Once you do that, then go and watch the next video, which is on the filters and the insert effects, and try and apply those to your sounds. I hope you've learned and gained something from this video. At Soundflow Music Academy, if you want to learn more, we do offer one-to-one courses in Milton Keynes, in Surrey, and soon in London. And the nice thing about the Academy is that we actually offer real-world opportunities. So we just took 22 of our DJ graduates to Ibiza in June, and we performed in Eden, in Es Paradis, in Pure, and in Ibiza Rocks Bar, and a lot of them got scouted as well by record labels, which is always amazing. It was an amazing experience for everybody. And yeah, it's sort of things like that we do to try and help you get your foot through the door in this competitive industry. So if you enjoyed the video, please leave a thumbs up and see you on the next one. Take care.